What is going on, everyone? DSP here, and the gaming year of 2017 has finally come to a close. And although this year, I would admit, had a lot better of an overall offering of game releases than over the last few years, still, there were a bunch of games that sadly just did not live up to their potential. Maybe the games just stunk from the get-go, maybe the online implementation wasn't great, and for the first time in a while, we've seen some running patterns among new release games that basically holds them back. That's right, games that maybe would have been great if it weren't for certain kind of practices becoming more mainstream and more commonly accepted in the gaming world that sadly, in my opinion, held these games back. So this is going to be my rundown of the top 13 absolutely most disappointing games of 2017. It's perfectly fine if you disagree with me, and if you do and you want to sound off, you can always message me on Twitter at TheyCallMeDSP, or you can post up over on my kingofhate.com forums. Without further ado, let's run through the countdown, but before we do, I just want to make this clear, not every game in this countdown is a bad game. Just because a game is disappointing doesn't mean that overall it's bad. This is not the worst games countdown, this is the most disappointing. Some of these games I actually felt were good, but because of one or two elements, just did not live up to the maximum potential that they basically could have. So without further ado, here we go. It's Darkside Phil's Top 13 Most Disappointing Games of 2017 Countdown. Number 13, Middle-earth: Shadow of War. Now, as I was previously saying, not every game in this countdown is a bad game. In fact, Shadow of War, in my opinion, is actually one of the better releases of 2017, and is actually a significant improvement over its predecessor, Middle-earth: Shadow of Mordor. The combat is better, the parkour is better, the actual system of recruiting orcs is better. There are tons of improvements over the previous installment that just make this an overall better game. But there's one core element of Shadow of War that holds it back and makes it ultimately disappointing to the consumer. That's right, it's the running theme that you're going to hear time and time again throughout my most disappointing games countdown: microtransactions. For some reason, in 2017, both game developers and publishers alike decided to try to find a way to squeeze every single ounce of currency out of the consumer. It wasn't enough for you to just buy that game at full retail price. They also wanted to have a constant revenue stream coming out of seemingly every single game released this year. And so Shadow of War was one of the greatest offenders, where you had to open up randomized loot crates in order to have certain orcs join your army. Now, in the game's defense, did you actually have to use the loot crate system? No, you could have completely ignored it and spent countless hours, upwards of a dozen or more hours, grinding aimlessly through the game to recruit high-level orcs from the wild. However, the ability to actually find the highest level orcs to progress through the final act of the game was nearly impossible, to the point where you would have spent so much time wasted. A lot of people probably just sunk some extra money in the game to buy these crates and get the higher level orcs right away so they could rush through that final act and just get right to the ending. Now, to make matters worse, the entire final act of this game is completely worthless. It's added into the game blatantly to pad the length of the game so you don't see the true ending, and you feel that the 20 plus hours that you've invested already basically was either a waste if you decide to quit at this point, or it was too much to waste, and so you're gonna force your way through this crazy ass grind of at least a dozen hours, or it's going to try to convince you to sink more money into the microtransactions. So it's ridiculous. Why play 12 plus hours or pay extra money just to go through one final act that has nothing to do with the story of the game at all, just to see a 3-minute cutscene at the end? It's a horrendous practice. It's terrible game design. It's a way to rip off the consumer, and WB Games should be ashamed. Even though Shadow of War overall is a great game, that's why it makes my most disappointing games of the year list. Number 12, Agents of Mayhem. When I first heard about this game, hearing that it was going to be a new IP and franchise from Volition Studios, the same people who made the Saints Row franchise, I was ecstatic. I loved Saints Row 2, 3, and 4, and I was waiting very fervently for a new installment. Sadly, it seems that the game developers, sometime amidst the development of this game, lost their way and just forgot what made the Saints Row franchise popular. Gone is the kind of adult-oriented, sexualized, tongue-in-cheek, ridiculous, over-the-top humor that used to be in this series. What happened is the series turned into this kind of almost SJW kind of a cast of characters that are so diversified that they kind of almost lose their identity, because you realize every character is meant to be a different kind of race or some kind of different kind of generalized character to represent another minority group that maybe was missed when they were designing the game. The characters aren't very interesting and aren't very fun, with the exception of a few like the ninja, who allows you to have to do hand-to-hand combat, while everyone else just does very generic third-person shooter gameplay. The game itself is incredibly repetitive. It's an open-world concept just like Saints Row. However, almost every single mission is incredibly similar. Rush through, kill a million generic enemies, get to the next part, rush through, kill a million generic enemies, etc., ad nauseum. There's almost no variety, there's almost no interest to the game. There are a few boss fights that maybe pique a little bit of interest, but outside of that, there's almost no reason to play this game. It's literally a 20 to 30 hour endless grind of boring combat, almost no interesting story, and by the way, the game doesn't even have a definitive ending, so after you waste 20 to 30 hours, you don't even feel fulfilled when you finally see the credits roll. Agents of Mayhem is a key example of how a game developer that's done well in the past tries to mix things up and then completely screws it up with their latest offering. I certainly hope that Volition Games gets back on track with whatever they pump out next. Number 11, Dishonored: Death of the Outsider. Now, normally I wouldn't include an expansion or DLC release as a major number in one of my countdowns at the end of the year. However, in this case, Death of the Outsider is an exception because it was released as a standalone game for a discounted price rather than as an required add-on for already owning the game Dishonored 2, which released in late 2016. So what's wrong with Death of the Outsider? I mean, the graphics look the same, the gameplay looks similar to the other Dishonored games, and quite honestly, I enjoyed both Dishonored 1 and 2, so what's the problem? Well, two things. Number one, the game still performs poorly on consoles. I played this on the PS4. It still had a choppy frame rate. The physics were wonky. It didn't seem to be as exact as you would want it to be using these teleportation and jump abilities. It was actually pretty hard to judge the distance that you were moving, which could just lead to a lot of frustration. But you know what? That was pretty much a same issue that happened in the original Dishonored 1 and 2 that I really didn't have too much issue with. So what is it really that holds back Death of the Outsider? Well, the thing that made Dishonored 1 and 2 great games is because if you played as Corvo, or in the sequel if you played as his daughter, you were able to create your character's abilities based off of your own desires as they leveled up over the course of the game. Maybe you wanted your character to be a melee dynamo where they could teleport in and do incredible kinds of parries and attacks using supernatural powers to tear apart every enemy in hand-to-hand combat. Maybe you wanted it to be a stealth master where from the shadows they could do stealth executions or teleport around or behind enemies undetected. Pretty much however you wanted to play the game, that's how you could play Dishonored. But in Death of the Outsider, the game developers decided to go a completely different route, since you don't play as Corvo or his daughter, but instead as one of the supporting characters from the cast of Dishonored 2, who doesn't have a wide variety of abilities. In fact, this character can only use stealth and is incredibly weak in hand-to-hand combat, meaning you are forced to play this game in the method of stealth and avoid combat as much as possible. If you didn't like that and you didn't play Dishonored 1 and 2 in those methods, obviously you're not going to like this DLC, and sadly for me, that's what was so disappointing. The game just became a monotonous grind of sneak by this, sneak by this, sneak by this, sneak by this, and with absolutely no variety. I played into this for about 4 to 5 hours, got bored with it, and couldn't even finish it because I was so bored with this expansion. It's so different from what it feels like, that freedom of designing your character and making them your own in the original game and sequel, while this standalone expansion really fails to live up to that expectation, and so for me, it makes my disappointing games countdown. Number 10, For Honor. Speaking of games that seem to have a lot of potential and then just kind of fizzle at launch, For Honor was a prime example. I mean, how could you go wrong? A game that combines the style of Vikings, medieval warriors, and samurai into one. 3 different kinds of classic warrior groups all thrown at each other in a melee for the ages. But when For Honor was released, people very shortly realized that sadly it's all about the implementation. And when the game launched online and people realized there were 2 critical flaws, they got up in arms. Number 1, the game had peer-to-peer servers instead of dedicated, meaning that every match match you played was completely randomized. One match may be perfect and have a flawless connection where you could do epic duels and all kinds of fun stuff, while the next match you're teleporting around, the game is slow as dirt, you can't time anything, and in a game that 100% has an online focus like For Honor does, you need to have the ideal state when you're playing the game in an online setting, and you didn't have that at launch because the game developers decided to only go peer-to-peer and skimp out on spending enough money to get dedicated servers. Now later down the line, i.e. some 6+ months after release, the game developers got so much backlash they did implement the dedicated servers. Problem being, it didn't matter anymore because most people had bought the game and aren't playing it anymore. They gave up on it months before, and the game pretty much fizzled out and died, which leads to the other point, the reason that the game fizzled out and died. Microtransactions. Yes, ladies and gentlemen, if you can believe it, again, that pattern that you're going to hear throughout this whole countdown reared its ugly head earlier on in the year when the gear that you get for your warriors in For Honor was completely randomized. Yes, you would fight matches and earn experience points and unlock gear that you don't know what you're getting. Therefore, you could end up getting a million cloned gear that you don't need instead of getting that one critical piece of gear that could actually give you the stat or the boost that you're looking for. This randomization factor, the loot box factor, the microtransaction factor to level up your character is a horrible one, but again, that's what they went for in For Honor, and so many people were so frustrated stating, man, it could take upwards of weeks to months to even unlock half of the stuff in the game. We're not going to play that much because that's ridiculous. The game developers again kind of tweaked that system during the course of the year as well, but again, it was too little too late. Here again, a game that could have been amazing if the game developers had actually maybe did some research ahead of time to find out what the consumer was looking for in dedicated servers and the lack of these loot box microtransactions. Instead, they implemented them, the game failed at launch, and despite all of their efforts to fix it, nobody cared by the end of the game's life cycle. Thank you for watching, everyone. I hope you enjoyed this part, and if you did, I hope you'll check out all the other parts of my year-end series. Please, if you liked this video, consider giving it a like right here on YouTube and also subscribing to my DSPGaming channel, where daily I upload all of the backup archives of all of my live streamed gameplay, tons of different game playthroughs and the like being uploaded here on a daily basis. Or if you prefer and you want to be part of the interactive live streaming experience, head over to my Twitch channel at twitch.tv/DarksidePhil. It's been experiencing exponential growth in the last year, and I'm looking forward to more live streaming in the future. Thank you guys very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.